I'm Steve Olsen of the Historic District Commission, and today we're at the Edward Beals house. You'll often hear the term unique applied as an adjective to things, and it's often misused. But in this case, in the case of the Edward Beals house, it is a unique house. It first was a subdivision, an early subdivision house built in about 1925, an example of a house being built out of the urban area. Second, it was designed by Michigan's first female architect. But most importantly, the style was a fashion that was used in some other parts of the country, but not used at all in Farmington Hills. It's called Storybook Tudor. And today we're at the Edward Beals house with the owners, Ken and Melody Klemmer. Ken, you know this house better than anybody.
Intimately.
Yeah. How long have you been here?
So we moved here. We actually first saw the house in June of 2013. We attempted to purchase it only to find out that it had already been sold. We went and looked at several other historic properties, and this one, the sale had fallen through, so we were able to come back to it. And we finally got a tour of it. We decided this was the one, and then we went through several months of literally hostage negotiations trying to close a deal on the house. The house didn't appraise. It had a lot of issues at the time. So it was an adventure. We finally closed on the 30th of July in 2013.
And a lot of things have changed since then.
A lot of things have changed. The grounds were completely overgrown. Every tree that had ever been cut down on this property was still here, chopped up into logs. We moved 2 30-yard dumpsters just full of rotten wood off the property. The former owners, while they had taken pretty good care of the outside of the house, had done a lot of renovations on the interior, changed things substantially. It was sort of Victorianized when we walked in. When we first saw the house and we came into it, we thought, or I thought, something isn't right about this. It didn't look like this originally. So we started doing a little bit of research and
the exterior and the interior didn't match.
Yeah, exactly. But the exterior looked pretty good. They had done a pretty decent job of that. It was just horribly overgrown. You couldn't see a lot of the detail of the house until we chopped down the 50-year-old shrubs, and then you could start to see what was really here.
It's so much. How do you start once you were clearing back all the shrubbery? You know, did you come up with a plan on how to?
I did. I used my experience as a project manager, and we put together a very detailed plan with milestones of what we were going to hit each month. This was almost like a full-time job. So we spent a lot of all our weekends, all our evenings, kind of stripping things back, seeing what was here, and trying to preserve the original fabric of the house wherever possible. Many of the walls that you see in the house were covered over with paneling, the exterior walls, that is. It had then been painted, and then it had been wallpapered over, so all of that had to be removed to start to expose some of the original plaster. The fireplace, which we'll see on the tour, was completely walled over and covered in drywall and black marble. So there's kind of a funny story about that. On Christmas Eve, the first year we were here, Christmas Eve 2013, sitting in the living room enjoying the tree and the fire, and I'm looking at that wall and Melody said, "Well, why don't you go get a saw?" So we took a mirror down that we had above the fireplace, and we cut a big opening in the wall there, and we could shine a flashlight in there and see exactly what was going on behind it, and we could still see all the original stone. We had a photograph of the original fireplace, so we knew what it had been originally. It was just completely covered. So that we put the mirror back up and continued on with Christmas, but that started the seed of the fireplace restoration, really the restoration of all the main public rooms in the house.
So you did have photograph evidence of...
We had a single photograph. Our neighbor next door, her sister had purchased this house in 1970 from Franklin Sullivan, who was a longtime resident here. He lived here, I think, from 41 to 1970. And she purchased the house. They did extensive interior renovations of it. They tore out the Pewabic tile bathroom and all these other lovely things. But but they did have some of the photographs showing what the original materials were like, so that was fortunate.
Edward Beals, what do we know about him?
We know surprisingly little about him. We know he was born in Massachusetts. I have his draft records. I have his marriage certificate. I have his census records. He was born in 1887, I believe. So he was in his about 30 by the time World War I broke out. He was a real estate agent. He worked for Dow Gilbert Realty at 1232 John R. in Detroit. He was a manager there originally, and then he went into his own real estate business. And this subdivision was part of his idea to create country estates in an area that was only an hour outside of Detroit. Northwestern Highway had just been completed. You could drive from downtown to this area in an hour. So that was considered great.
That was the commute.
That was the commute.
A lot of people would like that commute today.
We had an interurban going up and down
That's true.
Orchard Lake Road at that time, so you could get to Pontiac. You could also get to downtown Detroit on the interurban. You could exchange at Grand River and head down to Detroit, probably faster than you can by driving a car today.
But some things interfered with his plans, didn't they?
Yeah, a little thing called the Great Depression sort of got in the way. So they built 11 houses in this neighborhood. Many of the houses were purchased by the executives in the real estate company, which was the Great Lakes Land Corporation. So the treasurer lived down the street. The secretary lived down the street. The treasurer, who is Archibald Jones, actually bought the house 2 doors down from this one on Ardmore. And the Beals' daughter, Christine, was married to Archie. So they lived 2 doors down from mom and dad. Kind of convenient. By 1934, the Depression had worsened. No more houses were being built.
Right.
This house went into foreclosure. It shows it being bank-owned by 1935. The Beals moved to Florida and presumably stayed there the rest of their life.
We also referenced that it was architect designed.
Right, and this was, as you mentioned in your introduction, a rather unique house because the storybook Tudor style had its roots in California and Hollywood and the movie industry. And there was this great drive to create these nostalgic, sort of whimsical types of houses. And you see them all over in the Hollywood Hills, which was called Hollywoodland at the time. That was a great subdivision that was developed, all with houses that look like this one. So Edward Beals must have been aware of this kind of development. And being a promoter sort of fellow, he thought, well, if I have the latest style here in Michigan, it will attract buyers.
Sure, it's fashion, it's marketing.
It's slick, it's exactly what I want. So he built this house in that particular style. It's a little more restrained than some of the ones we see in California. It wasn't really in Emily Butterfield's repertoire at the time. She was more accustomed to doing colonial revivals, and you see those examples around the neighborhood. This was probably a little outside of her comfort zone, I imagine. But she did a nice job.
Emily Butterfield did work a lot in the Farmington Hills area, and I think I heard that you actually have a book that she wrote.
I do. She worked with her father, Wells. They were partners in the architectural business. Emily Butterfield is actually more well known for her work with the Alpha Gamma Delta sorority, which she was a founding member of in Syracuse, New York, and she is revered among sorority historians. Not so much known for her architectural work. There's not a great number of commissions by her that survive. There's several more by her father, Wells. But they lived here in Farmington. They lived actually in downtown Farmington, so this was a short commute for them. They lived on Warner Street near Shiawassee in Farmington. They had houses built next door to each other. They were pretty much inseparable their whole lives until Wells passed away. And then Emily moved back up to Algonac, which is where she was originally from, and stayed there.
I've heard rumors that she was also an artist.
She was an artist. We have one of her paintings behind the camera behind you. it's not one of her best works, but she was a watercolorist. I've seen some of her other works, which are really beautiful, but this one I found on eBay for $25, so I couldn't pass it up.
You were living in the house while you were doing the restoration.
Yes, and as I said, we're very organized, so it was never really that uncomfortable. We clean up after ourselves. We would pretty much do a project, clean up, and be able to still function in the house. The worst thing was doing the plaster work and doing the plaster repairs. That was about a 1.5-month long process because of the cure time for the plaster. So they had to come in, they had to remove all the damaged plaster, which was 3 days of intensive, messy work. We then kind of cleaned everything up after they had fixed the plaster, and then we had to wait 40 days for it to cure adequately before we could paint it. So that was about the worst. That was kind of the low point in the tolerance level. Okay. The other interesting thing with the house was it had a laundry room in the basement. The basement is pretty scary. In fact, it originally didn't even have an inside stairway. You had to go around to the outside of the house to access the basement.
The storm cellar type entrance there.
Exactly. And at some point, an inside stairway was put in to replace a pantry. But when we moved in here, my wife had only one condition, and that was, I'm not doing laundry in that basement. So we converted the butler's pantry off the kitchen into a laundry room. So that we departed a little bit historically from the house when we get into the kitchen, but very functional, and we think it's a great idea.
Did you have any discoveries as you went through the process? Very often there's a surprise or two waiting for a new owner of a historic home.
Surprisingly few. We had the house inspected. My work as a preservation architect and interior designer had me pretty well prepared for this one, so there wasn't anything that was too frightening that we ran into. We did find a few things. The place where the original maid stairway to the second floor was. The original stairway is still accessible underneath the stairs to the third floor. You can still see the original wallpaper in there and some things like that. We pulled out a cabinet to be able to see that. And we discovered that there was a sink in the guest room because it was important to be able to have your guests to be able to wash up. This was an era before you took a shower every day. Right. So having a sink in a bathroom, in a bedroom rather, was an important thing. So we were able to find an original sink to match the plumbing spacing, what we think was in there, and put that back. Other than that, not too many. We didn't find any gold bullion or anything like that. We didn't find a wall safe hidden somewhere behind the paneling full of cash, unfortunately. One of the interesting things we did run into in conversing with the woman who grew up in this house in the early 1970s. Her name was Stephanie Sprague, and she had alluded to a secret compartment in the master bedroom, and she said, go find it and see if what I left in there is still there. And in there was Mr. Beals' shaving kit, and it's still in that secret compartment. Really? Underneath a built-in dresser. Yeah. Huh. Yeah, so that was kind of neat that was still there.
Are you going to leave anything of yours?
We're probably going to do some type of time capsule in there, yes. Other than that, we found some chunks of coal at the coal chute, and that's about it.
So you've converted to more modern heating system?
Not really. The house was originally heated with one pipe steam, so it had a coal boiler in the basement. Okay. And it's a single pipe going to each radiator, and the steam travels in the top of the pipe, and the return water, as it condenses out from steam back into water, travels down the same pipe in the opposite direction. So it's kind of a very simple steam heating system. It worked terribly when we moved in here. I don't know how they ever heated this place. Most of the radiators didn't work, so we went through a program of fixing all those and getting them to operate properly. But we're still running the boiler that was probably put in the 1950s. Originally oil converted to gas. Right. Probably not the most efficient thing in the world, but it does work really well, so we stay pretty comfortable in here.
The lighting in the house is really interesting. How did you determine how to do that? Because it's got it creates a real ambiance, a real quietness throughout the house.
That was an important criteria of mine. Being an architectural lighting designer as well as interior designer, I was specifically looking for a house that we could adapt period lighting to. Some of the period fixtures were still in the house when we purchased it. Others we found had been replaced with something from Home Depot, so we went and purchased historic fixtures, restored them, and put them back in their proper places. But just choosing the color temperature of the lamps and having this very warm light would have been appropriate for a house that was in this transition period from arts and crafts to the more modern age. So we try to maintain that warmth and feel throughout the house.
Any next projects?
The next big project is the windows. We have windows on the north and east side that have not been restored. They still have their original putty in them. So the ones on the south side and the west side have already been done, not very well, but they're at least watertight. So our plan is to restore those on the north and east side. We've begun that process. The original storm windows and screens to the house were in the garage when it burned about 10 years ago. So all of those were lost. We have one example left. So we're going to create new storm windows, wood storm windows, to match the original ones and remove the aluminum ones.
Ken, tell us a little bit more about the outside. It's really interesting and dynamic from the outside in terms of appearance. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the storybook Tudor style was all about creating this appearance of age, of great age. So the roof, for example, is purposely sway backed. It builds up at the ends, at the gable ends, and looks like it dips in the middle. That's not because it's old and falling down. It was made that way, and you can see that framing in the attic. The roof itself suggests a thatch roof that would have been used in England centuries ago. It was originally cedar shingles and then was converted to asphalt shingles. Probably in about the 1950s was the first asphalt roof was put on it. The past owners completely restored that roof, but kept all the original faux thatch hallmarks of it with the curved eaves, the rolled eaves, the interesting pattern work at the gables. So that was preserved. The entire house is constructed with fireproof construction. All the exterior walls are terracotta block, which was called hollow clay tile. So from the basement on up, that's hollow clay tile, which gives you a little bit of insulation because it's got an airspace in each one, so it gives you some passive insulation. There's no insulation whatsoever in this house. That was then stuccoed over with a lime-based stucco, and then on the inside, the hollow clay tile is plastered. Okay. That's it. There's no other materials in there. The half timbering, the decorative half timbering, was applied directly to that hollow clay tile, and the stucco was then troweled in between it. It's really in wonderful shape. We have very few problems with that here in the house. The windows are generally grouped. You'll see them in this room in particular, where we have three gang together. That's another hallmark of that style of having many windows grouped together. That's an arts and crafts derivation as opposed to the Victorian period when you had individual windows. The stonework around the chimney and around the front porch, that was largely covered up when we bought the house. It was all covered with vines and shrubs and things. We really couldn't see how pretty it was, but that's all original as well. The landscaping itself, as I mentioned, was completely overgrown. The shrubs were 8-10 feet high around the house. You really couldn't see even the first floor windows in a lot of cases. Working from historic photographs, we started to pick plants that would have been in use at the time the house was built and put the landscaping back, reshaped the beds to something much more geometric, which would have been more appropriate for the time, and restored the landscaping back to something that would have been reasonably close to what you would have seen in 1925.
Since Beals was the developer of, I assume he probably had access to good craftsmen.
He did. This house was very, very well built. Maybe even more well built than the other ones in the neighborhood because it was his own personal house. The census records in 1930 show the house being valued at $40,000, which was incredibly high for the time. Now, he may have embellished that for some of his own personal reasons, because the other houses in the neighborhood fall in the $10,000 range or $12,000 range. But it does have a very high degree of craftsmanship. The wiring is all in conduit. It's just very well put together. And it's really stood the test of time, including having 8 children living in here before we were here.
That's fantastic. Ken, let's see if we can see a little bit more of the house and go on a
Great.
tour.
Thank you.
Ken, this is a little bit different than most houses that you see today.
Yes, the purpose of having a vestibule at the front door of your house was to keep cold air from blowing into your living room. So you had an airlock type of system. You would leave this door closed and walk out the front door, and vice versa. When you came back in, you could take off your coat in there. There was a little tiny radiator in the corner, so it kept it warm. And then you'd come into the room proper, which would be more economical from a heating standpoint. It also created a sense of entry experience. So it was this compression in a very small room, something that Frank Lloyd Wright had talked about as early as the turn of the century. This idea of compression and then coming into a larger space made the next room feel that much bigger.
Interesting. The fireplace is fabulous.
Thank you. The fireplace was, as we mentioned, a bit of an excavation process. So in other changes in this room, you see all this beautiful decorative plaster. Most of that on the outside walls was covered. They nailed furring strips onto the wall every 16 inches, paneled over that, and then subsequently painted and wallpapered that paneling. They put up crown molding at the perimeter of the room, at the ceiling, and took off this wonderful picture rail. We were able to figure out that the picture rail was there because we could see the grounds, the wood that was embedded in the plaster at that height. And some of the old picture rail had been used to create the furring strips for these walls. So we knew what the profile looked like. We knew where it was located, so we recreated all that in the restoration of this room. Everywhere where they put a furring strip up, they pounded a concrete nail through the furring strip, through the plaster, and into the hollow clay tile block.
Right.
That blew out a chunk of plaster about that big,
Right.
every nail, and there was thousands of them in this room. So we had a plaster restoration expert come in, and he said, "You'll never know I was here when I'm done." He was able to match the texture and the technique of the original plaster perfectly. It's very hard to spot any of the damage that was done to it. One of the other advantages we found when we pulled off all that paneling was there was junction boxes for wall sconces all around the room, which we couldn't see. So we were able to find that the wiring was still there, it was still active, it still worked via switches that had also been covered over, so we were able to restore all that to the original design intent.
Those are great old push-button style switches.
These are actually reproduction switches that you can still purchase today that are UL approved. We have some of the original switches in the house, which have a much more satisfying clunk when you push them in. These are little tinny
little more mechanical sounding. Yeah.
As I mentioned, we're in the process of restoring windows in this room, so that's our next big project to get the windows back in.
Ken, let's take a look at the dining room.
Okay. So the dining room in this era would have been a place where you entertained your guests. You had lots of space in this room for furniture, things like buffets and china cabinets, such. It had lighting that was all the way around the perimeter. Again, we have wall sconces, all these wonderful original wall sconces, which were made by the New York Bronze Company to give this very soft illumination of the room. Same type of detailing that you saw in the living room with the picture rail, which avoided you having to hammer nails into your nice plaster walls to hang pictures. So you use chains to hold up the pictures. Again, the same cove ceiling detail as well. The central light fixture, chandelier in here, was not original to the house, but it would have been very typical of what would have been found in that period. The doorway to the kitchen separated the servants' quarters from the guests' quarters or the owner's quarters. So you would have always had closure between those spaces, and never the twain shall meet unless you were being served. One thing that we should point out here is this is the original watercolor by Emily Butterfield. We're not sure the date of this painting, probably the 1950s, but that is an example of one of her works. We also have a watercolor by Danae Hoppy over on the other side of the buffet, which is of the house when we purchased it.
Let's take a look at the kitchen. The kitchen, you've obviously worked on it to make it again feel of the period.
That's correct. This was sort of an adaptation, our interpretation of a 1920s kitchen. We used materials that you would have found at the time, but we were also saddled with 1970s cabinets, which we had refinished, so they at least looked a little more of the period. What you would have had in the 1920s originally was not a lot of counter space. There would have been a work table in here, there would have been a very large stove and a wall-mounted sink, maybe some upper cabinets, but primarily those would have been confined to the butler's pantry. And
so it was a real work area in the 1920s.
it was a real work area. It was very utilitarian. It was not a place you brought your guests. It was strictly off limits.
Let's continue.
Again, at the service entrance of the house, we have another example of a vestibule. The door's been removed, but you can see that transition space, keeping cold air from coming into the house, was again used in this type of area. The lavatory, the first floor lavatory, has been restored to look largely as it did originally when the house was built. This room would have probably been more exclusive use of the maid. She would have had a door that closed off this wing of the house from the public areas, and she would have used this space. Again, there's no bathtub in here. There's simply a toilet and a sink.
Good.
This space, the den, would have probably been Mr. Beals' office originally. It's one of the spaces that we haven't gotten to in the house, so it's decorated in the previous owner's interpretation of the style, which involved lots of black paint. There would have been a stairway in this room originally for the use of the maid, which would have gone up to the second floor. We can still see the vestigial footprint of that on the floor here under the rug. And the stairway would have run in this direction opposite of the main stairs to the house. And that was done so that the maid never had to be seen crossing through public areas of the house while you were entertaining.
I'd like to see the upstairs.
Okay, let's go on upstairs.
Can these stairs qualify as unique as well?
They're very, very steep, much steeper than we would see in a house built today. Some of that was just the constraints of the house. The ceilings were high. There wasn't a lot of room to run stairs, so they ended up being at a almost 45-degree angle. The headroom is also very low as well. Mr. Beals was not a tall man. We don't know about his wife, but I presume she wasn't very tall either. I have to do a little duck every time I go up and down the stairs.
Well, I appreciate the handrails.
They're very nice.
Where are we now?
Right now we're in the guest room of the house, a fairly large room. You'll notice that most of the bedrooms in the house, and most of the rooms for that matter, have multiple windows. There are 5 windows in this room, encouraging cross ventilation. One of the interesting things that came about after the influenza epidemic in 1918 was it was considered healthfully beneficial to sleep with your windows open in all types of weather. So you would have heating systems in houses of this period that were very oversized, capable of heating the room adequately, even with the windows open in the middle of winter. The sink in the corner would be used for your guests to wash up. This was an era when you didn't necessarily take a bath every day, so being able to wash your face and wash your hands in the room was considered a convenience and a luxury.
That certainly was an improvement over a wash stand.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Exactly. Most of the bedrooms feature dressers that are built into the wall. Large closets, again, a little unusual for the time period that it would have had generous closets like this. I attribute this somewhat to the fact that Emily Butterfield was a woman and knew what a woman would want in a house as opposed to what a male architect might think was appropriate for storage.
Interesting. What is this small room?
This small room was the maid's room. Matilda was her name, Matilda McLean, and she lived here with the Beals and took care of housekeeping duties and cooking. She did not have any type of plumbing in this room, so it would have been assumed that she would use the main bathroom of the house, maybe when the owners were away. Very unusual.
So this must be the master bedroom.
This is the master bedroom. It's largely unchanged. The wallpaper was added, which is a period type of reproduction, something like you would have seen in the 30s or 40s. But the lighting fixtures, the sconces are original. They're actually the same type that you see in the dining room downstairs. Again, a lot of windows, 5 windows in this room, encouraging that good cross ventilation and airflow. It's considered helpful. We see the built-in drawers, just like the guest room has. All the woodwork in here is shellacked gum wood. And then another set of drawers on this side as well. The door to my right here is originally went to a dressing room, which is now part of the master bath when it was enlarged.
There's a real quietness to the house that I love.
Yeah, it's very comfortable. One of the things we were surprised with living in modern houses for so many years is how quiet it is. When the windows are shut in the middle of winter, it's just, you can't hear the TV running in the next room, which was very important to us to have that separation, that acoustical separation.
Ken, thanks so much for showing us your house today. You know, the preservation that you've done over the last couple of years is phenomenal and very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.